The courtroom fell so silent, I could hear the old ceiling fan clicking above the judge's bench. I sat there with my hands folded over a worn leather cane, trying to ignore the ache in my 73-year-old knees. Across the room, the president of our homeowners association, Linda Crawford, wore the same confident smile she'd flashed at me for nearly a year. She thought she'd already won. After all, she told everyone in the neighborhood that I was nothing more than an old thief who stole HOA property. It all started over a brass faucet, a single outdoor faucet. According to the HOA, I'd supposedly sneaked onto community property in the middle of the night, removed the antique fixture from the neighborhood clubhouse, and installed it on my own garage. The accusation spread like wildfire. Neighbors who used to wave at me suddenly looked away. Children stopped cutting across my yard. Someone even spray-painted "thief" across my mailbox. I scrubbed the paint off myself 3 times. Linda never once apologized. Instead, she demanded nearly $12,000 in damages, legal fees, and community restitution. When I refused, she smiled. "You're an old man, Harold," she'd said while standing on my porch with 2 HOA board members behind her. "Nobody's going to believe you over an entire association." I looked her straight in the eye. "I don't need everybody," I answered quietly. "I only need the truth," she laughed. Now, months later, that same confidence was beginning to disappear. My attorney, Rebecca Lawson, stood slowly from the plaintiff's table, carrying a faded county archive box that looked older than anyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said calmly, placing the dusty box onto the evidence table, "we've located the original construction records for Mr. Harold Bennett's property, dating back 38 years. Linda shifted in her chair. Her attorney frowned. Rebecca carefully lifted one yellowed photograph from the box, then another. Finally, she unfolded an original plumbing permit, signed decades before our neighborhood HOA had even existed. The judge leaned forward. "So you're telling this court?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. That faucet never belonged to the HOA." Linda's face turned pale. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." The judge adjusted his glasses and reached for the document. "I think," he said gravely, "everyone in this courtroom needs to see this." As the clerk handed the evidence toward the bench, Linda suddenly shot to her feet. "Wait!" she shouted. But it was already too late. "My name is Harold Bennett, and until all of this happened, I believed I would spend the rest of my life in quiet retirement. I was 73 years old, a widower, and a retired plumber who had worked nearly 45 years across central Ohio. If a pipe burst in the middle of a January freeze, or a family's basement flooded on Christmas Eve, I was usually the one climbing into the truck before sunrise. My hands were rough from decades of work, but I'd always believed there was dignity in fixing things instead of replacing them. That little brick ranch in Maple Grove, just outside Columbus, wasn't just another house to me. It was the place my late wife, Eleanor, and I had bought in 1988 after saving every extra dollar we could. We planted the maple tree in the front yard ourselves. I poured the concrete walkway with my own hands. Every room carried memories: birthday parties, Thanksgiving dinners, and evenings spent on the porch, listening to summer cicadas, while Eleanor read mystery novels beside me. After she passed away 6 years earlier, maintaining the property became my way of staying connected to her. Every repaired fence board, every trimmed rose bush, every polished brass fixture reminded me of the life we'd built together. The neighborhood had always been friendly. Most of my neighbors knew me as Mr. Harold, the old plumber who never charged teenagers for fixing a leaky hose bib or helped young couples install their first water heaters. We looked after one another. At least we used to. Everything began changing after Maple Grove elected a new HOA board. Its new president, Linda Crawford, arrived with polished speeches about raising property values and modernizing the community. At first, I didn't pay much attention. HOA meetings had never interested me, and I'd always kept my yard neat enough to avoid complaints. Then the notices started appearing. First, it was a warning that my mailbox color wasn't community approved. A week later, I received a letter saying the flower pots on my porch violated updated aesthetic guidelines. Soon afterward came a fine, because my American flag, according to the board, had been left outside during a rainstorm. I paid none of them. Instead, I politely requested copies of the governing documents that supposedly authorized these new rules. Linda's responses were always brief. "Compliance is not optional, Mr. Bennett." Her tone bothered me more than the fines themselves. Then one Saturday morning, while watering Eleanor's roses, I noticed a white HOA SUV parked across the street. Linda wasn't alone. Two board members stood beside her, pointing toward my garage. One of them took several photographs. Then Linda slowly smiled. Something about that smile made the back of my neck tighten. I had no idea what they thought they had found. But deep down, I knew my quiet life was about to change forever. The following Monday, just after breakfast, I heard 3 sharp knocks on my front door. Not the friendly kind. The kind that tells you whoever's outside isn't coming for coffee. When I opened the door, Linda Crawford stood on my porch wearing a crisp navy blazer with the HOA logo stitched onto the pocket. Beside her were 2 board members, Mark Ellis, the treasurer, and Diane Foster, the secretary. Neither of them met my eyes. Linda held a clipboard. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice polished enough to sound rehearsed. "We're here to inspect HOA property that has been unlawfully removed." I frowned. "I think you've got the wrong address." "Oh, we most certainly don't." She stepped aside and pointed toward the brass faucet mounted on the outside wall of my detached garage. "There it is." I looked at the faucet, then back at her. "You mean that faucet?" "Yes." I almost laughed. "I installed that 38 years ago." Linda folded her arms. "Our maintenance contractor identified it as the antique fixture removed from the Maple Grove clubhouse last month." I shook my head. "Your contractor is mistaken." "No," she replied. "You're mistaken if you think we're going to ignore theft." The word hit harder than I expected. "Theft," I repeated. "You've accused me of stealing." Mark finally spoke, almost apologetically. "The fixtures are rare, Harold. They're difficult to replace." I looked him straight in the eye. "You've been to my garage dozens of times over the years. That faucet has always been there." He looked down at his shoes instead of answering. Linda pulled a document from the clipboard. "You have 48 hours to return HOA property or face civil action." "I'm not returning something that belongs to me." "Then we'll let the courts decide." As they walked away, my next-door neighbor, Susan Miller, stepped onto her porch. "Harold," she called quietly, "is everything okay?" Before I could answer, Linda turned around. "Mrs. Miller, I recommend you stay out of this." Susan crossed her arms. "I've lived next to Harold for 20 years. That faucet has always been on his garage." Linda smiled thinly. "Memory can be unreliable." By Wednesday afternoon, the situation had exploded. Someone had posted in the neighborhood Facebook group that I had been caught stealing historical HOA property. Within hours, the comments piled up. "Lock him up. No wonder dues keep going up. Being old doesn't put you above the law." Then things got worse. A sheriff's deputy arrived with a civil complaint and stood awkwardly on my porch. "Mr. Bennett," he said gently, "I'm only here to serve the paperwork." I accepted the envelope with steady hands, but inside my stomach sank. The HOA wasn't just demanding the faucet back, they were accusing me of fraud, property theft, and intentionally destroying community assets. They wanted nearly $12,000 in damages, and if I refused, they intended to place a lien on my home. Standing alone in my driveway, staring at the papers, I realized this wasn't about a faucet anymore. Someone wanted to make an example out of me. I barely slept that night. The civil complaint sat on my kitchen table beside a cold cup of coffee, and every time I looked at it, I heard Linda's words echoing in my head. "Nobody's going to believe you over an entire association." By sunrise, I had made up my mind. If the HOA wanted a fight, I wasn't going to face it alone. The first person I called was Rebecca Lawson, a local attorney whose father and I had worked with decades earlier. She specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for being calm, methodical, and impossible to intimidate. When I walked into her office carrying the lawsuit and a folder of old home records, she listened without interrupting. She didn't roll her eyes at the story or dismiss it as neighborhood drama. Instead, she asked one question. "Harold, are you absolutely certain that faucet has been on your garage since you installed it?" "I'd bet my house on it," I answered. She smiled slightly. "Good, because they already are." For the next 2 hours, we spread every document I had across her conference table. Receipts, handwritten maintenance notes, faded photographs, and even an old toolbox where I kept permits from jobs I'd done on my own property. Most of it proved I had maintained the house for decades. None of it directly proved when the faucet had been installed. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "We need something older than memory." The next morning, she drove us to the Franklin County Records Office. An elderly records clerk named Thomas Grady greeted Rebecca like an old friend. "What mystery are we solving today?" he asked with a grin. Rebecca explained the lawsuit. Thomas raised an eyebrow. They're claiming ownership of plumbing installed before the HOA even existed. That's what we're trying to verify. For nearly 4 hours, the three of us searched through archived subdivision maps, construction permits, plumbing inspections, and microfilm records dating back to the late 1980s. Dust coated our hands. My eyes ached from reading faded documents. Then Thomas suddenly stopped turning the microfilm reel. Hold on. He enlarged a permit on the screen. The permit referenced exterior plumbing installed during my home's original construction. Rebecca scribbled notes. It's helpful, she said, but not enough. As we prepared to leave, Thomas hesitated. You know, there might be one more place to look. He disappeared into a restricted storage room and returned carrying a weathered archive box tied with fraying cotton string. I almost forgot these were transferred from the old township engineering office years ago. Rebecca carefully untied the string. Inside were original contractor files, inspection photographs, and handwritten field reports that had never been digitized. Then she froze. She slowly lifted a faded color photograph and slid it across the table toward me. There, clear as day, was my garage. The date stamped on the corner read, June 14, 1988, and mounted on the wall beside the garage door was the exact same brass faucet the HOA claimed I had stolen. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I simply stared at the photograph. The garage looked almost new. The maple tree Eleanor and I had planted was no taller than my shoulder. My old pickup truck sat in the driveway, and there, mounted exactly where it still hung today, was the polished brass faucet. Rebecca finally broke the silence. Harold, she said quietly, this doesn't just help your case. She looked directly at me. It destroys theirs. Thomas reached back into the archive box. There are more. He carefully handed us 3 additional photographs taken during different stages of the home's final inspection. Every single one showed the same faucet in the same location. Better yet, each image carried an official township date stamp and inspector identification number. Then Rebecca found something even stronger. Folded inside a manila folder was the original plumbing inspection report from June 1988. Under the section labeled Exterior Fixtures, the inspector had handwritten, Owner installed solid brass hose bib on east garage wall, approved during final inspection. Rebecca smiled for the first time all day. That's not just evidence, she said. That's contemporaneous government documentation. On the drive back to her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since Linda had accused me, I believed the truth would actually matter. But Linda wasn't finished. 2 days later, before we had even filed our response with the court, I walked outside to find bright orange violation notices taped across my front door, garage, and mailbox. The HOA had cited me for overgrown shrubs, an unauthorized mailbox, improper driveway maintenance, and even claimed my porch light violated community standards. Every violation carried another fine. Rebecca looked at the stack and shook her head. They're trying to bury you in penalties. That afternoon, things became even uglier. As I mowed my lawn, Linda walked past with several board members. She didn't stop until she reached my driveway. You still have time to settle, she said. I shut off the mower by admitting to something I didn't do, by paying what you owe. I don't owe you anything. Her smile disappeared. You know what happens when people fight the HOA? I shrugged. No. Tell me. They lose their savings. She took one slow step closer. They lose their homes. Before I could answer, Susan Miller walked across the street carrying her phone. I heard every word, she said firmly, and I recorded it. Linda's expression changed instantly. That conversation was private, Susan laughed. You had it in the middle of the street. Without another word, Linda turned around and walked away. Rebecca later added Susan's recording to our growing evidence file, arguing it demonstrated a pattern of intimidation and retaliatory enforcement. By the end of the week, our trial binders were complete. They contained decades-old government records, inspection reports, dated photographs, witness statements from longtime neighbors, copies of every HOA notice, and Susan's recording. As I buttoned my suit jacket the night before court, Rebecca placed a hand on my shoulder. Tomorrow, she said, they stopped controlling the story. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I was ready to tell mine. The courtroom was already filling when Rebecca and I arrived the next morning. Residents from Maple Grove packed nearly every wooden bench. Some had come out of curiosity. Others had spent months believing I was a thief. I recognized neighbors who had avoided me at the grocery store. A few couldn't even look me in the eye. Linda Crawford entered with her attorney, Gregory Hale, carrying 3 thick binders. She walked confidently past me without saying a word. But I noticed something different. She wasn't smiling anymore. When the bailiff called the room to order, the judge, the Honourable Margaret Ellis, took her seat. "Counsel," she began. "Let's proceed." Mr. Hale stood first. He painted a simple story. According to him, the HOA had invested heavily in restoring the community clubhouse. During a renovation, an antique brass faucet disappeared. Their maintenance contractor later claimed to have identified that exact fixture on my garage. He pointed toward me. The defendant knowingly retained property belonging to the association. Rebecca didn't object. She simply took notes. Then came the HOA's first witness, the maintenance contractor, Kevin Ross. Under questioning, Ross insisted he had recognized the faucet because of its unique design. Rebecca rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Ross, are you a licensed appraiser of antique plumbing fixtures?" "No." "A historian?" "No." "A metallurgist?" "No." She nodded. "So your identification was based entirely on looking at it?" "Yes." Rebecca walked to the evidence table and held up enlarged photographs of 5 nearly identical brass faucets from homes built in the late 1980s. "Can you identify which one supposedly came from the clubhouse?" Ross studied them for nearly a minute. I'm not sure. "You testified under oath that it was unique." He swallowed hard. "It looked unique." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Next came Susan Miller. She testified calmly that she had lived next door to me for 2 decades and had seen the faucet on my garage for as long as she could remember. She also described Linda's threats outside my house and confirmed she had recorded the conversation. When the audio played through the courtroom speakers, people who fight the HOA lose their homes. The room became uncomfortably still. Linda stared straight ahead. Finally, Rebecca stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Thomas Grady." The retired county records clerk carried the weathered archive box to the witness stand. One by one, he authenticated every document: original permits, inspection reports, archived construction files. Then Rebecca removed the faded 1988 photograph from a protective sleeve. She placed it on the courtroom display screen. Gasps echoed across the gallery. There was my garage. There was the brass faucet, and in the corner, the unmistakable government date stamp. June 14, 1988. Rebecca handed the original plumbing inspection report to the judge. "Your Honor, this document was created years before the Maple Grove HOA was formed. It specifically approves the installation of Mr. Bennett's exterior brass faucet during the home's original construction." Judge Ellis adjusted her glasses, reading each page carefully. Then she looked toward Linda. "Miss Crawford," she asked evenly, "before I rule, I have one question." Linda shifted nervously in her chair. The judge held up another document that had just been admitted into evidence. "This internal HOA email appears to suggest your board knew these county records existed months before filing this lawsuit." The color drained from Linda's face. Her attorney slowly turned toward her. In a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Linda, is that true?" Linda didn't answer right away. She stared at the document as though it had appeared out of thin air. Her attorney, Gregory Hale, leaned closer and whispered something I couldn't hear. Judge Margaret Ellis wasn't interested in whispers. "Miss Crawford," she said firmly, "you are under oath. I asked you a direct question." Linda cleared her throat. I don't remember seeing that email." Rebecca stood immediately. "Your Honor, with the court's permission." The judge nodded. Rebecca displayed another exhibit on the courtroom monitor. It was a chain of internal HOA emails obtained during discovery. In one message, sent nearly 4 months before the lawsuit, the HOA's own architectural committee had written, "County records indicate the Bennett residence had its exterior brass fixture installed during original construction. We recommend verifying ownership before pursuing legal action." Below that was Linda's reply. "Proceed anyway. We'll deal with the records later." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Even Gregory Hale looked stunned. He slowly removed his glasses and turned toward his client. "You never disclosed this to my office?" Linda couldn't meet his eyes. "No." Judge Ellis closed the file in front of her. "That omission is deeply troubling." After a brief recess, the judge returned to the bench and delivered her ruling. "The evidence presented leaves no reasonable doubt that the brass faucet installed on Mr. Harold Bennett's property has been part of his home since 1988, years before the Plaintiff Association came into existence." She paused before continuing. "The court further finds that the HOA failed to conduct a reasonable investigation relied upon unreliable identification, and proceeded despite possessing evidence that contradicted its claims. Linda lowered her head. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. A wave of relief washed over me. But the judge wasn't finished. The court also finds that the association engaged in retaliatory enforcement and litigation conducted in bad faith. She ordered the HOA to pay all of my legal fees, reimburse every improper fine they had assessed against me, remove every public accusation from association records, and issue a written apology. Then she added one final sentence that no one expected. This matter is referred to the county attorney for review of potential civil fraud and fiduciary misconduct by the responsible board members. The room erupted in whispers. Outside the courthouse, local reporters were waiting. By evening, television stations were covering the story of the retired plumber, falsely accused by his own HOA. Within weeks, Maple Grove homeowners demanded a special meeting. Linda Crawford resigned before the vote. 2 board members followed her. A forensic audit later revealed years of poor governance, selective enforcement, and misuse of association funds. New leadership was elected, transparency rules were adopted, and residents approved independent oversight for major legal decisions. As for me, I drove home that afternoon, parked in my familiar driveway, and looked at the old brass faucet, catching the afternoon sunlight. I reached over, turned the handle, and watched clear water flow into the grass. It had never been about a faucet. It had been about the simple truth that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to take away an honest person's good name. Several months have passed since the judge cleared my name, and life has finally settled back into the quiet rhythm I once took for granted. The maple tree Eleanor and I planted continues to grow. The roses still bloom every spring, and that old brass faucet remains exactly where it has been since 1988. Every time I turn its handle, I'm reminded that the truth may be delayed, but it doesn't disappear. The experience changed me. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't about being loud or angry. Sometimes it's about staying calm, keeping good records, and refusing to surrender your integrity when someone tries to rewrite the facts. I also learned that one honest neighbor, one determined attorney, and one fair judge can make all the difference when the odds seem impossible. If my story resonates with you, I'd truly love to hear yours. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or a false accusation that turned your life upside down? Share your experience in the comments. I read every one of them, and your story might encourage someone else who's facing a similar battle. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life inspired legal dramas, property disputes, and neighborhood justice stories, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until next time, remember this: your reputation is worth protecting, and the truth is always strongest when you have the courage to stand behind it.